Hello, this is Jeffrey Tucker of the Brownstone Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be here with Sunetra Gupta, Oxford. And Sunetra, I just have to say, it's wonderful to see you again. So,
Oh,
welcome.
it's a great pleasure.
I suppose it's been quite some time, right?
Yeah, it's been a year and a half almost, right?
A year and a half, and what a year and a half it's been, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder. So I thought today. I know you're interviewed, constantly about the matters of the pandemic and trying to get you to predict this and predict that. But in the time we have, I thought maybe we would explore something that I always found very intriguing because, quite frankly, you changed. What was it changed? You added to or helped me have a theoretical understanding of the relationship between pandemics and society that I had previously lacked. I mean, when this whole thing broke, I needed a kind of a big theory, something to help me understand the integration between the presence of infectious disease and the operations of society and the ethics surrounding that. And I read your wonderful book on Amazon, and then I heard you speak about it. And I just thought we'd use this time to sort of explore this theme a little bit. And let me just introduce the discussion with the following questions. Very often, I've heard you say that something has gone very wrong with our understanding of the relationship between ourselves and infectious diseases and the social political order. You've said this. We need a new way to think. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, in some ways, I was suggesting that we should return to an old way of thinking, or what I had thought was an established way of approaching the problem that you mentioned, which extends well beyond infectious disease, of course, which is what is the relationship between an individual and society? How do we understand that in a way that is robust to various, let's say, emotional stances, emotional attitudes one might have? And so, that there is a tendency for people to equate political positions simply with some sort of moral position or some emotional kind of construct, or some sort of some position that one has developed with regard to one's fellow human beings before considering what is the actual pact, what is the actual covenant in terms of, as a society, how we function. So what I mean to say is, if you there are ideas floating around always that one has to cut through about whether your politics are being informed by compassion. Why do you not want poor people to starve? Is it because you care about poor people, you can't bear to watch child starve? Is it because you feel that God did not want this, or that you have a morality which does not permit it? And all of these forces come into play, but they're diverse. And what one wants, just as you said, is a kind of robust framework. Call it a theoretical framework, but yeah, a framework of understanding that cuts through all of that. And so I found the concept of a social contract to be one that helped me in the way that, as you just described, of trying to, find a way to reconcile the different kind of the relationship between the individual and society in ways that transcended some of these other more individual
Mhm.
elements. So the way I
But
see it is, sorry, maybe.
well, by social contract, maybe we'll get to this. So we're not talking about anything rationalistic or written. You're speaking of a shared understanding that society develops over time. That's endogenous to our experience. Out of which we secede only with great trepidation, for example. But otherwise, we share this among all of ours, among everybody in the social order. Is that correct?
It's certainly not written. It's neither written nor is it much spoken about, and that may be a problem. That may be why we forget that this is what actually underlies the cohesion that we enjoy in society. And but the way I understand it, almost as a physical scientist, is that it's like a kind of optimal solution. It's where the needs of the individual intersect with the needs of a society. So it's a sort of point at which you can do no better. If you become more individualistic, you will actually do worse than if you abide by a set of unwritten, unspoken rules that we share, sort of a set of covenants that are in place, which, I mean, as you say, they're not explicit. They're not taught to us. We don't go to school. We don't sit down and learn. This is how we actually live together. This is why we pay taxes, is to build roads, because if we didn't pay taxes, we wouldn't have roads. And that is a benefit to all of us. And it's not because we want, or the reason we don't want a huge inequality of income is because it's detrimental to all of us. Those particular ideas where we regulate society so that overall the outcome is the best possible outcome for each one of us is not explicitly discussed. We don't sit down in school and learn about that. We learn about principles of compassion and love and also of general government and how things work, but not this basic underlying principle.
And for listeners who might reject your example of public roads on empirical grounds, speaking to you from the land of private roads, can we also add in there basic understandings of public health, like we desire clean water and clean air and good sanitation? Would you include that within this sort of shared understanding?
But those are very obvious ones, and whether or not public or private roads work still fits within that general understanding of, how are we going to do this? We need roads. Shall we allow farmer so-and-so to own a stretch of road and charge us a penny when we use it? Or shall we all put a penny in the pot and construct a road that nobody exactly owns? Which is the better way to manage it? And I think that kind of rather basic example, I think in some ways does, for me, reflect some of the fundamental difference between what is traditionally known as left-wing, right-wing politics. It's just about, what's the best way to manage this or come up with a solution to that problem.
Now, I don't want to immediately to skip any steps here, but I wonder how you could, if you could apply this in the case of a crisis like a pandemic, and the tendency for this crisis environment to shatter this sense, which I think has happened to us over 2 years. Or do you not want to go there just yet?
No, I do. I was going to go there via the what you said, clean water and all of that. Those are straightforward public health issues, which we know that if we all choose not to empty our garbage into the river, then we'll all be better off, even though it might be, as an individual, one is always tempted, or as an individual, there's always the possibility you can cheat. It's just a standard game theory kind of situation. But really, where it tends to, the optimal solution is where you all do abide by the rules and not throw your slops into the river. So that's a fairly straightforward enactment of that kind of principle. But when it comes to infectious diseases, it's a little bit more complex, because what you have here is not such a straightforward linear kind of solution to the problem. You have a pathogen which is propagating between, amongst a set of, within the community. You have the pathogen that comes in, it spreads, it creates herd immunity, which is again a concept that is critical to, or which is a very communitarian concept, in the sense that it has at its base the idea that because a lot of people are at any point in time immune to infection, they are actually thereby protecting those who are vulnerable and might die from infection, because the risk of infection is reduced. So contrary to many people out there who think herd immunity is a highly individualistic approach, it's actually deeply communitarian, in that's what actually ends up protecting the vulnerable. But all of this sort of dynamic whereby exposure to the pathogen is what creates the conditions that then protect others, and of course eventually yourself when you become vulnerable, and also the accommodations that are made in terms of accepting that a certain number of people will die from an infectious disease, and that that one cannot at any stage focus simply on keeping a single infectious disease under control, to the exclusion of all other problems. These are all very basic concepts, I think, that are embedded within the social contract.
The idea of herd immunity, and we can't just dwell on this too much, but it is a fairly modern, how should I say, discovery, right? Or the discernment that there's such a thing that exists as a certain number within a community. Certain people acquire immunity through exposure, and that thereby protects other people, because then the pathogen cannot find new hosts. And maybe you can work this out mathematically, depending on what the pathogen is. That there's no certain rule right? It's highly contingent upon the properties of the particular pathogen in question. But this is a modern idea, right? It was a 20th century discovery.
It formally, yes, but I mean, I think in any experience of epidemics, it's long been recognized that you have the initial wave because the epidemic arrives on what used to be called virgin soil. So if a lot of people are susceptible, you will get a big epidemic. And then the concept of immunity upon infection, whether to disease or further infection, has of course been with us for a very long time. So just simply knowing that eventually, once an epidemic arrives and passes through a community, that it never has the same impact, that the acute phase then is over, has been in people's minds, I think, for a long time. But what the questions that were raised this time in the context of this epidemic were, what should you risk in order to allow that state to prevail?
Right. So I'm looking at a situation here where, let's just pretend we've got 30% of the population that's going to be protected, and 70% of the population that's going to experience exposure and recovery, and some element, undiscernible element in there, since there's never perfect protection or riskless exposure. Some people are going to experience severe outcomes. But this is the game. So we know this going into the pandemic, and I mean, we don't know this, but let's just say we did. The pathogen comes. Now you get to have the social and political argument, right?
Yeah.
About who bears the risk, and what's my understanding of your presumption going into this whole thing is that the people who should bear the risk by continuing to engage in normal social functioning are the people who are not the vulnerable, the people who can bear the exposure, and the people who should be protected are those who are the vulnerable populations. And this is how you, in your mind, you allocated, the social divisions. Is this correct? I mean,
Yeah, that's a very fair way of putting it. Indeed, yes.
yeah. And so in this case, I mean, maybe you could say it was fortunate, but we knew very early on with SARS-CoV-2 that it had a very strong, probably predominant age vulnerability element there. And what's striking about this idea of age is that it's universal, right? So it's not
Right.
as if one class gets old or one race gets old or one language group gets old. It's being old and potentially vulnerable to this pathogen is a universal principle. In that sense, is non-discriminatory. But
Yes.
that's not how somehow we chose to allocate this risk, is it?
No, the risk was allocated to the lower socioeconomic classes, really, which contained people who were, of course, not just elderly, but those with comorbidities, who then succumbed to some of the worse outcomes of infection. And then, of course, there was this sort of inversion of cause and effect. And so what happened in a nutshell is that people from certain socioeconomic backgrounds were more likely to be cleaning the hospitals and driving the buses and delivering the food to the laptop classes, as Martin Kulldorff puts it. They were more exposed, and those who were vulnerable among them, who should have been protected, weren't adequately protected. And therefore you saw more deaths within those particular socioeconomic classes. And then this was used, somehow it was inverted, to say that unless we lock everything down, we are putting those classes at risk. It's a very, very circular and flawed argument. In fact, by locking down, we were selectively exposing those classes which, where those who had comorbidities and were vulnerable were more likely to die.
Yes, the message was stay home, stay safe, and there was a moral imperative associated with that. And the people who could, in fact, stay home and stay safe, professionally, socially, culturally, knew who they were, right? And but there are other people who knew for sure they couldn't stay home and stay safe, and so the message, became very clear. But also there was a strange Puritanism about it too. If you don't stay home, you're hurting others, and you're saying that in fact the opposite might have been true. That this was basically privileging people based on class, and choosing other classes to be the sandbags.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of putting it. And yes, it's extraordinary how people continue to push that idea that that we weren't protecting the elites. I saw recently an accusation levelled against myself and Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff that we ourselves belong to the elite classes, and therefore we're not championing that we couldn't actually, we didn't even have the right to make such a statement as to protect the vulnerable. That we shouldn't be talking about the laptop classes because we ourselves are the laptop classes.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting position. Yes, of course we are. We were able to. We didn't suffer at all, except through the insults of others during this period. But apparently this, by not being part of the underprivileged sector society, we do not have the right to champion them.
But it seemed as if they have very few champions at all, actually. I mean, we went through the better part of a year, if not a year and a half, with hardly anybody speaking about this subject at all, apart from the Great Barrington Declaration and the people who followed it. But I mean, generally in the popular culture at large, there was very little discussion about the massive discriminatory treatment of the working classes. And then in the U.S., in any case, we had these vaccine mandates that came into play that added another layer of exploitation, right? So suddenly you have the people with very likely the people with the longest and strongest natural immunities to the pathogen, and now being forced to get yet another layer of protection that very likely was unneeded, and then threatened at the pain of job loss.
Well, I mean, they did suffer job losses, and it's quite tragic that this was allowed to happen, and I'm glad to see that that's being reversed.
Well, I just got a note from another friend today that just lost his job as a result, so I'm not sure how much reversal is taking
Well,
place.
slowly.
Yeah, slowly.
I mean, but I mean, the other class of people who suffered are the children, and I'm just shocked to hear that the pronouncement on toddlers being masked in the state of New York. It's just incomprehensible to me that these.
Well, I mean, I know you've thought about this question a lot, but well, before I ask that question, do you see other examples in history? Because you're quite the historian and anthropologist. Other examples in history in which infectious disease or the arrival of a new pathogen is deployed as a way of demarcating the classes and intensifying inequality and denying people's rights, or social systems that are structured around this idea of clean and unclean. I mean, is this seems to be a trope throughout history that presumably in the modern times we rejected.
Well, exactly. I mean, when you think of avoidance of infection and its association with particular groups has always, has been a permanent feature of most societies. And as you say, it's only in the contemporary times that we've started to move away from that. And, we've been tested many times, such as with the HIV pandemic. And we passed that test. There was a period of intense stigmatization of those who are more vulnerable to HIV infection. That there were, but nobody in the end, that the general consensus was that we must try and live our lives without discriminating against those who have HIV. And we got there. I mean, it was difficult, but we got there. Whereas this time round, that sort of whole sense of balance seems to have just been abandoned. And actually here, I think we do move on to away just a little bit from just the logic of this to the the ethical and also the aesthetic considerations. So, I mean, I've started to think of all these problems as having a kind of logical kernel. Most of them can be defeated at that level. For example, should we vaccinate children? You know, if you look at the logic of it, if you look at how much at risk children are, what the risks of the vaccine are, the fact that it does not stop the spread of infection, you can defeat that idea at a logical level. But even if it were logical to vaccinate children, if you move beyond that kernel to the sort of ethics of it, does it make sense to vaccinate children with a vaccine whose safety record, still isn't fully clear, shall we say, in order to protect the elderly? That's something, that needs discussion. And then you move beyond that to the aesthetics of it. And, one of your articles, which touched me very much, was to do with your experience in a restaurant where all these people were serving you in their masks, and the sort of unbearable kind of feudal aspect of it that you found distasteful. I mean, so morally, logically, absolutely illogical that these people should be wearing masks. Ethically, very questionable. And then, at the end of the day, the aesthetics of it is also a concern.
Right. I mean, so we're living in a society in which we all do serve each other. We have servers and the served, and sometimes we trade places. But the aesthetics of it should exist within a framework of equality and democracy, so that we're invited to believe that everybody around us is of equal dignity.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And that we can encounter them casually, but with warmth and friendship, with a sense of a fellow participant in this in the polity, and contributor to the ennoblement of our lives. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, we have these extreme class demarcations that, masked and unmasked, vaxxed and unvaxxed, essential, unessential. It was an astonishing sort of unleashing of a sort of a caste-like mentality that gradually, at least in the U.S., mutated into a kind of a friend-enemy sort of divisions that still exist today, that I've never seen in my entire life.
No, it does echo as you say, the caste system, the sort of untouchable versus those. I mean, even within so there was always in the Hindu system, there's the untouchable caste with whom you could have absolutely no interaction. But even within the other castes, there are all sorts of rules about who can receive a drink of water from whom and who can't, and all these sort of completely illogical and highly unaesthetic rules that are there to demolish the dignity of individuals. There are echoes in what transpired.
So there's always a tendency towards a sort of a revanchist spirit in all times, a desire to go back, a desire to divide and separate, demarcate, and segregate. But did it shock you, as an infectious disease epidemiologist, that it would be, a single pathogen that would cause the unleashing of this spirit in so many places in the world so quickly?
Yes, I was quite taken aback by that because, as you say, much of the social contract or the various ways in which it's enacted are quite tacit. But, for example, in the clinical community, there is an acknowledgement that, people die, and that at certain times treatment should be withheld, or indeed, expensive treatments perhaps should not be administered to someone who isn't likely to live beyond a few months, whereas, when it comes to children, one prioritizes the care of children. I mean, there are all these sorts of ideas which I thought were quite firmly embedded within our consciousness, collective and individual, which, as I said, although they're not made explicit, there is an understanding that, especially when resources are limited, they have to be allocated in a way that is fair with respect to, what each generation has already received or not received, rather than being sort of across the board. So in other words, the value of a young person's life is different to that of an older person. And some of these ideas, obviously, they needed at least to be spoken about publicly and debated, but they weren't. And maybe the truth is, we don't spend as much time thinking about these issues. We don't really confront them. We've got used to living life, an unexamined life, and that's part of the problem.
Now, within epidemiology, there did seem to be these problems developing leading up to the pandemic. In fact, I remember you wrote an article in 22 years ago now, I think, warning about the over mechanization of sort of pandemic planning and computer modeling as this sort of panacea, to solve all problems of pathogenic spread. And you wrote something like, the problems with these techniques and this newly acquired tools you have is that they create this illusion of certainty, and what is in fact a very fluid situation, and also invite someone into a false belief in the capacity for sort of perfect control, and you never believed that, and you wrote that 22 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was exercised from the start by how mathematical modelling, which is a wonderful tool, wonderful conceptual tool, was heading in this direction, that had been co-opted by people who wanted to use it to demonstrate an ability to predict the future, which is what everyone wants. And in this respect, it was, what they were really indulging in was a form of soothsaying, because you can't use mathematical models to make very specific predictions. It's just not the nature of the beast. What you can do is you can use them to make very valuable, construct very valuable theoretical frameworks. So in the case of this particular pandemic, a very simple model which is built along the lines of what we know about the other coronaviruses, can fully explain what's happened in pretty much every single setting. What we didn't know at the start of the pandemic is how much the non-pharmaceutical interventions would then skew that, but it was impossible actually to tell at that point. Now, because some of the models that included a very strong effect of these non-pharmaceutical interventions have completely failed to match with reality, we know that those assumptions were flawed, and indeed the virus behaved much as it would without any of these interventions being in place. But that's where the models are useful. They allow you to discriminate between different hypotheses. Did the NPIs work, or did they not work? To what extent did they work? And the answer was always going to be somewhere in between. They worked fully and they worked not at all. And now we can see, by comparing the data to the output of these models, that they're much closer to not having worked at all. That's where they are a useful, very valuable tool. What you can't do is take one of these models, throw in a million assumptions about how people are mingling and who's taking a bus from where to where, and come up with a specific number of how many people are going to die in the next 2 months.
Or the number of feet we should stand apart, or the number of regulations or rules that suddenly overwhelmed our lives were just incredible. All of which were sort of pronounced as canonical truth by an expert class who knew exactly how to control.
That's what's so worrying, is that they were pronounced as truths, when, I mean, some of them were, it was patently obvious that they couldn't possibly work, and others, like proper sort of complete stay-at-home orders, clearly reduced the interaction between people, but the extent to which they would actually slow down the epidemic was just not known. So at best, their effect was unknown. But mostly, I think, or with rules like the rule of 5, or how far apart to stand from someone, it was clear to anybody that those were performative. But what I often say is there was this sort of complete inversion of certainty, so that the things that what were we certain about? The one thing we were certain about was that lockdowns would cause harm, and that they would disproportionately harm the poor and the children. So the disadvantaged would be disproportionately harmed. That's the one thing we could be certain about. The rest was uncertain, and yet people behaved, or we were told that these things work. So certainty was displayed with regard to those very things about which there was extreme uncertainty, and I find that very strange.
For lack of a better term, like just sort of lockdown ideology, which I've called an ideology, which has struck me as almost a religious fervor, swept the world 2 years ago. In your profession, the number of people who believed in these sort of extreme measures and their capacity for pandemic control. 20 years ago was hardly anyone. Then 15 years ago was a tiny minority. Then 10 years ago there was more. Then 5 years ago there was more still. And for some reason, this outlook just gained hold just in time to somehow sweep away 100 years of public health experience and scholarship. Is that your read of this situation?
Yes, as you say, the illusion of control became stronger and stronger. So in the end, we became victims of the illusion of control. Why did that happen? Perhaps because there were certain areas of our lives in which we did experience more control than we had before because of technology. I think it was also happened because of a lack of education in critical thinking, in the arts, and the more nuanced ways of approaching problems. So as soon as people, there was an insecurity that developed concerning infectious diseases because life had become so safe in people's heads. The idea of an infectious disease of any sort arising, any kind of disruption, there was a sort of no tolerance policy that arose, I think, towards any form of disruption of the order that we existed in. And this was different, I think, because before this, people experienced far less control over their lives and also perhaps more hardship, or, I mean, it's hard to say, it's sort of perhaps unfair, but, that there were ways in which accommodations had to be made. That they knew that their parents, once you got cancer, you might die quite shortly, whereas now the treatments have improved and that's no longer true. So, obviously gaining control over certain areas of our health has been the most wonderful thing for all of us. But it's also had this effect that our expectations of life and how we're going to live it and what is important have been altered. And so, when this whole idea of pandemics and infectious diseases coming to threaten us started to gain traction, instead of thinking about how we might build our defences, the prevailing attitude was, let's hunt them down and kill them. So a lot of funding went into, let's go and sequence every single virus there is out there and suppress it, rather than let's try and think about the sort of broader ecology within which we exist with these pathogens and try and anticipate how we can build up protection particularly against the severe outcomes of a potential new pathogen, which could recruit such things as previous exposure to other related pathogens.
Right. There seemed to be a kind of a list of heresies that developed sometime after March 2020. It was difficult for you to even speak about the topic of herd immunity at all, because that implied permitting exposure. And that was deemed to be outlandish. In fact, the whole idea of exposure became a bit of a taboo topic. Even the World Health Organization changed its definition of population immunity to exclude the idea of getting infected, and to include only the idea of inoculation. And so it became, for 2 years, a very like a taboo way of saying, look, the pathogen's here. I'm going to live my normal life. If I get sick, I'll use therapeutics. And speaking of that, I don't know if it was like this in the UK, but in the US, there was no talk about therapeutics at all. I mean, hardly any in the early days, partially because of this presumption that everyone, by everyone I mean basically the professional classes, would avoid contact. We would not ever meet this virus, and we wouldn't and shouldn't and couldn't.
Yes. So that's, of course, it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how viruses propagate through communities and what eventually keeps them at bay, which is herd immunity. I mean, I don't know why did it become a dirty word? Why was the idea of being exposed to a pathogen deemed to be such a terrible event when we are regularly exposed to all sorts of pathogens? And this one was hardly new in the sense that it was just a cousin of the other coronaviruses that we live with, and the likelihood that it was, some monstrous variant of it was very small. But yes, so going back to the fear of infection with a new pathogen, why did that take over in that kind of a way? I mean, at the end of it, you'd have to say that the roots of that must be in some form of abhorrence of the other. I mean, it's just got to be at some very sort of basic level, it's got to be where that comes from, the worry that you will be invaded by an unknown. And I guess perhaps that's why it was not in anyone's interest to point out that this virus was actually not quite as much of an unknown as people like to make it out to be. Nor was its evolutionary trajectory likely to be completely outlandish. And indeed what it has done, although it's not necessarily something I would have predicted, that you'd get these successive waves or these new variants in such quick succession, it's very much within the boundaries of what a pathogen like this, a virus like this, might do, given the rate at which it evolves.
I mean, even 2 weeks ago, Sunetra, in the U.S., there is still not a good understanding of the vulnerability, the demographic, the heterogeneity. How do you say? Well, the gradient of risk associated with it. I mean, even I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, the presidential spokesman said we still don't know if older people are more vulnerable than younger people to SARS-CoV-2. I mean, this is actually.
I thought that was quite an extraordinary statement. I did see that.
Yeah.
I mean, we have known that for a very long time. A very long time.
Since January 2020 or so. Yeah. So.
Yes.
So.
It's quite surprising.
Well, let me ask you, because I think we're coming to the end here, and thank you so much for all your remarkable insights. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. I wanted to talk to you about 1918. I wanted to talk to you about the growth of immunities over the course of the century and the relative contribution it's made to the extension of our lives, which I've never heard anybody talk about except you. I mean, I've looked that up. I've done a literature search. You seem to be the only one who seems to understand it. It's not just about better food and medicine, which is great, but it's also about better immunities through international integration and travel and human rights. And there's a dissertation in that, if not a full research program. And thank you for that remarkable
insight. It would be nice if people started to think about that a little bit. I mean,
God, yeah,
it would help.
Yeah, which is to say, nationalism actually is unhealthy. It's very interesting.
I agree. No, but what's very funny is that those who are avowedly anti-nationalists had no problems taking a very nationalistic attitude when it came to keeping this virus out.
Crazy, yeah. So there's just so many topics associated with this, but I probably we should leave it there. But let me ask you this: in light of everything that's happened, I mean, do you still have faith in the capacity of human beings to learn from experience? and if we do have that capacity, what do you think the possibility that we'll, look back in 5 or 10 years and say, wow, that was a mess. Let's fix up our response next time and make it a little more democratic, a little more consistent with traditional public health, a little more focused on equality and approach the presence of infectious disease as free people who have universal dignity. I mean, what do you make of that prospect? What lessons will we learn, do you think?
Well, I think, it's difficult to say whether we will learn lessons. I was feeling very optimistic in February because in this country anyway, there seems to be a general awakening. Last year, very intelligent people were saying to me, well, what possible collateral damage can lockdowns have? And it seemed to me there had been an awakening in people's heads, in this country anyway, that yes, lockdowns, the consequences, the costs are profound. And also because of the mathematical models based on the assumption that the lockdowns work, catastrophically failed to predict what was going to happen when you removed those measures. That also, started alarm bells ringing, and there was a general sense of being able to start to question whether they worked at all, and even if they did, whether any benefits from lockdowns whether they were justified given their enormous costs. But of course, the forces that are trying to push the lockdown narrative out there are so strong, and they keep coming back and, pushing this idea in ways. It's not so much that they have a different viewpoint, it's the manner in which that viewpoint is expressed is just, it's completely does not permit the way that it's expressed stops all discourse. And if it's repeated enough times, people will start to think, yeah, well, the lockdowns were necessary, they caused harm, but they were necessary, and we had a moral reason to lock down. It's because the scientists who believed in lockdowns are saying, even though we have all the evidence now, it was still immoral not to lock down. It would still have been immoral. And so I'm not as optimistic as I was a couple of months ago that the data would simply, speak for themselves.
We've got a real problem of values and philosophy to deal with here, which seem to have broken down prior to the pandemic. That sort of understanding that we're going to have to recapture, and that's going to take a long time. And even if you get some technologically based or epidemiologically based regrets that maybe we went too far and that sort of thing, that moral understanding of the imperative of allowing society to continue to function, even in the presence of infectious disease, it seems nowhere near dawning on anyone, certainly not in the U.S. in any case.
I think the best approach is to ask people to consider the logic of it, because you can't argue against the logic. I mean, we, as societies, we tend to agree largely on certain logical principles. We also generally tend to agree on ethical principles, but there are variations. And then politically, we start to diverge as we come out of that, as I said, logical core into the ethical mantle and the political crust or whatever. So it seems to me the most robust way to approach this is by trying to defeat some of these ideas at the level of logic. But having said that, I know that the whole of the atrocity itself spread way out of that logical core into the ethical dimensions, and questioned, really shook the ground under our, it really questioned our understanding of how societies are constructed in the first place.
Well, I suppose that's the best we can do to hope for coming out of this. I know you feel no satisfaction at all in being vindicated. I mean, which is a tragedy in a sense. I mean,
It's
you
too
should be
late now.
yeah, you should be celebrating all the time, but you don't feel celebratory because the carnage is all around you and me.
No, exactly. I mean, if I mean, it was already quite late when by the time we gathered, the disparate voices that was saying gathered to produce such statements as the Great Barrington Declaration and others such efforts. But at the time, you know, if we had a proper discussion around this, maybe some of this could have been averted. But now it's too late. So there's no pleasure to be taken.
Well, Sunetra, thank you so much. And I didn't mention at the outset that you're a novelist and epidemiologist. I've read as much of your work as I possibly can, and I would be delighted to put anything that's not currently in print in print at the Brownstone Institute because I adore your contribution you've made, and you've flattered me so much by letting me be your student for the last hour. So thank you so much, Sunetra.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and very nice to see you again.